through the cold, sterile halls of the alien citadel. Nyara walked us each step where her last their heart pounded louder, with every passing moment an unwelcome reminder of her duty. The ritual was near, and the weight of expectation lay on her shoulders. She was chosen, not by desire, not by will, but by necessity. The grand rites demanded ceremonial bonding between the human males and her kind, the Zeratos secure the future of their species. But the thought of a human male, one of those estranged creatures with their violent pasts and primitive instincts, sickened her. She had seen them in holographic records, she had witnessed their wars, their savagery. How could such a creature be worthy of this sacred role? Nara's long-arrayed scent, hair a shimmering cascade of blues and silvers, framed her sharp, angular face, accentuating the cold determination in her violet eyes. Her body lean and sinewy moved with a feeling and grace, though every movement now felt deliberate and controlled. As if each muscle could betray her reluctances, she wore the ceremonial robe of her station, flowing white silk that clung to her like a sequined skin. Yet if Eltley, a cage trapping her in a fate she hadn't choose, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of metal doors sliding open. A pair of guards stood at the entrance to the chamber of binding, their helmets obscuring any emotion as they regarded her with a nod. Her time had come. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, and the low hum of ancient machinery. In the center of the chamber stood the bending altar, a platform surrounded by shimmering crystals that pulsed with a dull light, responding to the energy within the room. The high priestess, her long white robe, as nearly blending into the floor, waited silently, her presence commanding, though her face remained unreadable beneath the deep hood. Nara's gaze shifted to the far side of the chamber, where the humans stood. At first she felt nothing but disgust. The soldier was tall, his broad shoulders encased in some sort of military uniform worn and weathered from countless battles. His face was rugged with sharp features, softened only by the faintest trace of fatigue. In his eyes, brown hair cut close to his scalp, stubble lining his jaw, but it was his eyes, deep, piercing green. At caught their off guard. There was something in them, something different from the cold, uncaring stare she expected. Vulnerability, paint. This was the man sent to breed her. He looked out of place, standing there in the ceremonial space, the very antithesis of the purity it represented. And yes, she shifted slightly under her gaze. Nyara noticed something strange. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickened. Was it fear, anger? She couldn't quite place it. She only knew that it wasn't what she expected. The high priestess began to speak, her voice calm, yet each word carried a weight that pressed down on Nara's very soul. The time has come to fulfill the grand rites, the joining of human and net. Zerathi, survival of our species rests upon your shoulders. Nara, daughter of the Zeraline, and you, Lieutenant Jason Cole of Earth's 9th Infantry Battalion, bear the duty of your people. Jason, his name was Jason. Nara's fingers twitched beneath the FB fabric of her robe. A nervous tick Shararli exhibited. She despised this being paraded like some sort of prize. Her sharp nails dug into her palm, the slight pain helping to keep her grounded. Yevris kept drifting back to him. She didn't understand it. This presence unnerved her. He was so human. His flesh was baring, places skin exposed to the cold chamber air. His heartbeat was nearly palpable in the silence between them, matching her own chaotic rhythm. Why did he not seem like the others? Jason shifted on his feet, his boots making the faintest scuff against stone floor. His face remained unreadable. But Nara sensed the tension radiating off of him. He was more willing to be here than she was. It should have been reassuring, but it only deepened her own confusion. Do you accept the rite of binding? The high priestess asked, her voices lissing through the air like a blade foe. Ramo Mentnoon spoke. A thessalence became unbearable. Nara's lips parted, but her voices stuck in her throat. She didn't want this, couldn't want this, but the consequence of refusal, those were far worse. As she glanced at Jason, hoping to find some trace of the monster she'd been told about, the beast that lived in every human male. But her remained stoic, his gaze locked somewhere above her, as if staring into a distant memory. I accept, Nara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words tasted like as Jason hesitated longer, his jaw clenching as she inhaled deeply. Yes, darkening with some unspoken thought. I accept. The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the room seemed to shift. The crystals surrounding the altar began to glow brighter, their pulses syncing with the rapid beat of Nara's heart. She stepped forward, her legs feeling heavy, each movement a conscious effort to suppress the rising panic in her chest. Jason stood before her, now towering above her, his presence overwhelming in a way that both frightened and entreated her. His hands, callous and scarred, hung at this side's fingers, flexing involuntarily. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the cool sterility of the chamber. It unsettled her. The high priestess began the ritual chant, their voice a loud melodic hum that echoed throughout the chamber. The words were ancient in a language long forgotten by most of their kind, but Nara understood their meaning. The binding was as a cred connection, one that transcended the physical, was a merging of two soul Sonyan that was meant to ensure the survival of their species. But as the chant continued, Nara's mind raced. How could she possibly bond with this human? He was an outsider, a stranger, 3D. And as she stood before him, something in her began to unravel. The fear she had harbored for so long, the disgust, the revulsion, it was all still there, but something else was stirring beneath the surface. Jason's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw him not as the enemy, not as the monster she had dreaded, but as a man who, like her, had been forced into a fate neither of them had chosen. The chant grew louder, the crystals vibrating with energy. Nara could feel the pull of the ritual, the invisible force drawing them together. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body tense with anticipation. Jason's hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, and hovered just inches from her cheek. His fingers twitched, unsure whether to complete the gesture. Niara held her breath, every fiber of her being waiting, and then in the space of a heartbeat his hand made contact. The warmth of his touch sent a shockwave through her, a sensation so intense it nearly took her breath away. For the first time, Niara felt something she hadn't expected. Nara's skin burned where Jason's fingers rested, the heat of his touch seeping into her like molten fire. Her breath caught in her throat, the sensation far more intimate than anything she'd prepared for. The contact was brief, fleeting. His hand grazed her cheek, then fell back to his side, but the lingering warmth remained. She fought the urge to step back, to retreat into the safety of distance. But her body betrayed her, her pulse quickened, her skin prickling with awareness. She could sense the eyes of the high priestess on them. Her presence earned her that this was no longer about personal truth. Voice there had begun. Jason stood just as still, his expression rigid, unreadable. But Nara could sense the tension thrumming through him. His hands were clenched into tight fists at this side. It's a sif. Ewash holding something back. The energy between them was charged, but neither spoke. Continue. The high priestess surged softly, her voice like the crackling of a distant storm. You must complete the ritual. Nara's heart raced. The words echoed in her mind, but they felt distant, detached from the turmoil roiling inside hers. She had imagined this moment over and over, how it would feel to be forced into this union with a human, how much she would despise him, how much she would resist. But standing here with him so close, as she couldn't bring herself to act out the anger she had expected to feel. Why couldn't she hate him? Her mind flickered with images, violent human wars, brutal men dominating their world, savages unworthy of their role in the right. But Jason, he was different. His presence wasn't harsh or commanding. It was reserved, burdened with something unspoken. He didn't move to claim her like some primitive beast. His eyes held a quiet torment that mirrored her own. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice breaking the silence between them. You don't want this either. Jason's green eyes locked onto hers, the intensity in them surprise. Singer, his lips parted, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, as though he was struggling to find the right answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low with emotion. I don't have a choice. His words were blunt, but there was no anger behind them, just airs that struck a chord deep within her. For a moment, the tension in Yara's chest loosened. She understood that wariness, it mirrored her own. I don't want this, she admitted softly, almost to herself, the words escaping before she could stop them. She felt raw, vulnerable, as if speaking her truth. The loud had peeled back a layer of armor kept hidden for too long. Jason's gaze is often just slightly his heart, and features relaxing in a way that made her pulse tutter. There was something about him that was disarming, even comforting. He wasn't what she'd expected, but the ritual demanded more than understanding. The binding required them to complete the physical act, tune at their bodies in a way that transcended simple touch. Nara's heart pounded at the thought, dread settling deep in her stomach. Could she got through with this? Jason took a step, closing the distance between them until the air between their bodies was charged with tension. His breath was shallow, his gaze unwavering, and Nara felt herself gravitated toward him as if drawn by some invisible force. Her body reacted on instinct despite her mind's protests. The high priestess spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of authority. You must connect the right demands. Union. Nara's throat tightened, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him, fingers brushing the rough fabric of his uniform. His chest rose and fell beneath her touch, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grounding her in a moment that felt utterly surreal. She had never been this close to a human, had never touched one in such vapors. On all way it felt wrong, and yet strangely right. Jay's eyes flickered with hesitation as she placed his hands gently on her waist, the touch light and cautious, as though he feared he might thwart. The warmth of his hands seeped through the thin fabric of her ceremonial robe, sending a shiver down her spine. Breath caught as she felt a wave of unexpected heat pool low in her stomach. She didn't understand this. She didn't understand him. Her body tensed as the high priestess chanted the ancient words, filling the air with an almost electric energy. The crystals around the impulse brighter, the light intensifying with each passing second. The bending was beginning to take hold, drawing them into its inexorable pull. Nyara felt it, the deep primal urge that the right awakened. It was the same instinct that had driven her ancestors to seek out the human males, the same force that compelled her body to respond despite her mind's protests. She hated it. That had the loss of control, but she couldn't fight. Their body moved on its own, pressing closer to Jason, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. Jason's grip on her waist tightened his breath. In growing more labored, his eyes were dark, filled with ATT tension that mirrored her. Nyara could feel the heat radiating off him, his body tense. With restraint, she could sense his struggle, the battle raging within him to maintain control. And it only heightened the strange connection forming between them. Her pulse quickened, her senses sharpening as the energy of the binding surged through her. The air around them crackled with an almost tangible force, and Nara's heart raced in response. Every touch, every breath seemed amplified, their connection deepening with every passing second. But the physical pull, there was something else, a deeper resonance, a thread of understanding that wed between them. It wasn't just the right she realized, it was them. They were both trapped, both unwilling participants in a fate they hadn't chosen, and in that shared misery, they found a flicker of empathy. Jason's hands slid from her waist to her lower back, his fingers spaying wide, pulling her closer until their bodies were nearly flush. The sensation was overwhelming, every nerve in her body coming alive under his touch. Nara's breath itched her skin, burning where they connected. The binding was taking over, pushing them toward the inevitable, and then for the first time since the rye, Tual began. Jason spoke again, soft, almost vulnerable. "You're not what I thought." Nyara blinked, the words catching her off guard. She had expected silence from him, perhaps even anger, but his voice held other instead. There was a quiet confession, something raw and unfiltered. She wasn't what I thought. Their throat tightened, her mind racing to comprehend what he meant. Did he see her as something more than just of self or the right? Did he see her Nyara, the individual, not the duty-bound daughter of the Ziri? "I'm not what I thought, either," she whispered, her voice barely awed. Eebly above the hum of the crystals, for a brief suspended moment, their eyes met, and in that gaze Nyara felt something shift. The fear and dread that had consumed her began to melt away, replaced by a strange, unexpected connection. She didn't want to be here, but perhaps neither did. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining, as the final words of the chant echoed around them. The energy surged, the light from the crystals blinding in its intensity, and Nara felt their body respond to the ancient call of the right, and then just as suddenly everything went silent. The high priestess lowered her arms, her voice fading into the stillness of the chamber. "It is done." Nyara and Jason stood frozen, their hands still entwined, their breathing enragged. The rite was complete, but as they stood, the rest staring at one another, Nara realized something unexpected. This was far from over. The silences stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Jason's hands still gripped Miusha's, warmth seeping into her palm as they stood together. In the aftermath of the rite, her skin tingled where their bodies touched, her senses alive in a way hadn't expected. Everything felt too intense, his proximity, his scent, the soft tree and fall of his chest against their yet beneath the physical sensations was an even deeper awareness, one that noted there from the inside. The bending was complete, their fates now intertwined in ways she couldn't undo, no matter how much she wanted to turn away, to pretend this never happened. The truth was undeniable. The high priest had spoken, there was no going back. Jason's grip on her hand tightened slightly, a subtle shift that pulled her back to the present. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and what she saw there left her breathless. His eyes weren't hard nor cold as she had anticipated. Instead, they were filled with something that mirrored her own confusion, her own uncertainty. It was as though in that moment they were both stripped bare, no longer Alan human, but simply two beings caught in a web of circumstance. Either of them had chosen what now. Nark's voice was trembling with a mixture of dread and resignation. Jason didn't answer right away, his gaze shifted, eyes flickering between her face and the empty space behind her, as if searching for something in the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, strained with an emotion he couldn't hide. We survive the simplicity?" Tyoff, his answer caught Nara off guard. Survive was that all they could hope for. She had been taught that the bending was sacred, that it was the key to saving their species from extinction. But standing here, the weight of the right pressed down on her chest like a suffocating force of survival, seemed the only goal left in their grasp. The high priestess, who had been watching them with an impassive expression, took a step forward, her long flowing robes swayed with the movement, the sound of the fabric brushing against the stone floor amplifying the stillness around them. She gazed at the two of them, here, yes, glinting with a strange mixture of satisfaction and finality. "The rite has been completed," she intoned, her voice low and solemn. "You are bound. Nara, Jason of Earth, what comes next is beyond our control." Nyara stiffened at the mention of her name. the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had known this day would come, had been preparing for it since her birth, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The high priestess's words echoed in her mind beyond our control, a flicker of rebellion full. Ardinara's chest while west, this truly beyond her control, was she simply meant to accept their fate, to give herself over to this human, this stranger, because tradition dictated. Their heart pounded in her chest, their blood roaring in here as a mix of fear and anger boiled beneath the surface. Jason's hands lipped from hers, breaking the fragile connection between them. He took a step back, his expression unreadable as she stared down at the ground, his jaw clenched tightly. Niara could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his posture, as if he was fighting so. Mething deep within himself, what are we supposed to do now? Jason's voice was barely more than a growl, the frustration seeping through. His calm exterior, we don't even know each other. He cut himself off, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The struggle was written across his face, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. As much as it was on her, Niara's wallowed hard, her throat tight. She felt it too, the crushing reality that there was not turning back. This was her destiny, but it wasn't just theirs anymore. Jason was a part of it now. Whether he wanted to be or not, there had bound them together, and no amount of resistance would change that. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her racing. Thought-sure body still hummed with the after effects of the bending, the primal energy of the ritual still coursing through her veins, but beneath it all a quiet resolve began to form. This was her life, her path, and if there was one thing she had learned from her people's ancient ways, it was that survival required adaptation. Nara said softly, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that coiled in her gut. She met Jason's gaze again, her eyes locking onto his. We're in this together now, like it or not. Jason's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing slightly. Asher Gay eyed her for a long moment. He didn't respond. The silences stretched between them, taut and heavy with unspoken words. Then slowly he nodded. The high priestess stepped forward, once more her hands clasped in front of her. Asher guarded them both with a critical eye. The binding is only the beginning, she said, her voice calm but laced with a warning. The challenges you face now will test not just your physical strength, but your will. You must find balance or risk destruction. Nara's heart lurched at the ominous tone in the priestess' words. She had heard stories of lead bindings of pairs who had been unable to withstand the intense connection, who had succumbed to the madness that came with resisting the rite. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Jason's eyes flickered with unease, but he didn't back down. His expression hardened, the soldier in him rising into the surface. We'll survive, he said again. But this time, the words held a note of determination, as if he was trying to convince himself. As much as sure, the high priestess inclined her head, her lips curling into a thin smile. We shall see. Without another word, she turned. Ands wept from the room, Harobus trailing behind her like shadows. The sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Yara and Jason alone once more for a moment. Either of them spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Nyara could still feel the lingering effects of the binding, the strange electric pull between them that seemed to draw them closer despite their mutual reluctance. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice low and hoarse. I didn't sign up for this. Nara's breath hitched at the rawness in his tone. He could heart the frustration, the anger, the helplessness, and she understood it more than she wanted to admit. Neither did I. Jason's gaze snapped to her, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, his hard exterior cracked, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the soldier. Then why? Niara hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Why? Because this was her duty, her responsibility, because the survival of her people depended on her, but none of that made the wait any easier to bear. Because I have to, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, just like you. Jason stared at her for a long moment, his green eyes searching her, as if trying to make sense of it all. Slowly, the tension in shoulders began to ease, his fists unclenching at his sides. The hostility that had simmered between them since the beginning seemed to be replaced by a quiet understanding. We stuck with this, aren't we? His voice was soft, the words more of a statement than a question. Nara nodded, her throat tight. Jason let out a low breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. Great, just great. A small bitter laugh escaped Nara's lips before she could stop it. Welcome to my world. Jason blinked, surprised by her sudden humor, and for the briefest of moments the corners of his mouth twitched in what could have been the beginning of a smile, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by the grim reality of their situation. We'll figure it out, the said after a long pause. His voice is steadier now, more resolute. Nara wanted to believe him, but as the weight of the binding pressed down on hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. The air in the chamber felt the heavier as Nara and Jason and stood in the thick of their shared silence, the binding pulse within the tether linking their fates, but beneath the surface as something darker stirred, Nyara could feel it, a tremor at the edges of her mind, a subtle shift in the energy around them. She wasn't sure if it was the rite itself or something more dangerous, something primal awakening deep within her. Jason seemed oblivious, though his face remained tight with tension. His green eyes darted around the ancient walls of the temple, as if searching for an answer to questions either of them could fully articulate. He was still adjusting to everything this world. The bending, her Nyara, Onder Edifit would all come crashing down on him, and how long it would take before the weight became unbearable. Her heart ached at the thought she had never expected to feel sympathy for a human, let alone this human. He was supposed to be just a tool, a means to an end. But now as she looked at them, she realized how deeply intertwined their lives had become. We need to leave this place, Jason finally said, breaking the stillness. His voice was firm, but there was an undercurrent of exhaustion. Staying here will only make things worse. Nara nodded in agreement. The ancient Tem, with its towering stone pillars and walls covered in the glyphs of her ancestors, felt more like a tomb now it had been the site of their binding, but its significance had diminished. They needed airspace as something to shake the suffocating weight off their chests. Together, they moved toward the exit, the wide arched doorway, LED into the twilight of the alien city, its sky painted in deep purples and reds, the two suns dipping low on the horizon. The city buzzed with life beneath them, her people moving in their daily routines, unaware of the monumental change that had just occurred within the temple walls. Narasto Lee glanced at Jason. His jaw was set, this eye scanning the horizon as if searching for an escape route. She knew that look, soldier instincts kicking in his mind, already formulating a plan of action, a way to survive. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something far larger at stake, something neither of them fully understood. Yet you said, we'll figure it out. Myra's voice was soft but carried the weight of her uncertainty. But how we're bound be something we can't control. Jason's expression softened slightly, though a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. I don't know, he admitted, but we'll have to start somewhere. They walked through the winding streets, the strange alien architecture looming over them. Tall spires glistened with bioluminescent patterns, the buildings curving and arcing in ways that defied gravity. The air hummed with the low frequency of technology far beyond anything Jason had seen on Earth. Yet, despite the city's advanced nature, it felt cold, distant, like a monument to a forgotten past. Narrow LED. Jason through narrow alleys and up steep stone steps until they reached the edge of the city where the dense forests began. The ancient trees with their silver bark and deep purple leaves cast long shadows in the fading light. They stopped at the edge of a clearing, the two of them standing side by side, the quiet of the wilderness, offering a brief reprieve from the chaos of their thoughts. What do you know about the binding? Jason asked, voice breaking through the stillness. What does it really mean for us? Nara hesitated, her fingers brushing the tips of the soft purple grass beneath her feet. The binding was as a Credmeistery event to her people. Only the high priestess and the elders truly understood its full power. But D being given glimpses, stories passed down through generations, warnings etched into their history. It's more than just a ritual, she said, her voice low. It's a fusion of souls. Since it's done, it can't be undone. Our lives are now connected in ways we can't see or understand. Yet Jason's brow furrowed, his gaze locked on hers. What kind of connection? Thoughts, emotions, pain, pleasure? Nara's voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. We can feel each other's presences, sense each other's desires. The stronger the connection, the more dangerous it becomes. Jason's eyes widened, a muscle in his jaw tightening. He was trying to process it all, trying to reconcile this new reality with everything he knew about himself. So, you're saying we'll link like telepathically on some level? As Nara nodded. But there was more, so much more that she hadn't even begun to explain. The deeper the connection, the more volatile it could become. There wasn't just about survival, it was about power, and if misused, it could consume them both. Jason let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Great, just what it needed. Mind melding with an alien, his sarcasm was thinly veiled, masking the fear that simmered beneath the surface of gnarled a pang of guilt. She hadn't chosen this any more than he had, but the burden was heavier for him. He had been dragged into her world, a world he didn't understand, and now he was trapped in it. With now it, I'm sorry, she said softly, surprising herself with the sincerity of the words. Jason looked at her, his green eyes searching hers for something and source, perhaps, or maybe just reassurance that they weren't doomed. For the first time since they had met, Niaras, the vulnerability in him, beneath the hardened soldier exterior, he was just as lost as he was. It's not your fault, Jason replied after a long pause. His voice was quiet, but there was a hint of something else in it. Acceptance, maybe. We're both in this mess. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing slightly. But just as Niara began to relax, a sudden surge of energy pulsed through her chest, sending a shockwave of heat radiating down her spine. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Asher bumbled with the intensity of the sensation. Her mind flared with images of light shadows moving in the darkness, and a deep throbbing hunger that twisted her insides. Jason was beside her, in an instant his hands gripping her shawl. Elders Nara, what's happening? She couldn't answer, her vision blurred, her body vibrating with energy. As the bending pulse within her growing stronger, more intense, it felt as though her entire being was being pulled in two directions, one toward Jason, the other toward thing dark and ancient, something deep within her. And then she felt it, Jason's presence inside her mind, his thoughts brushing against the row, and it was overwhelming, invasive. But there was a strange comfort in it as well. Their connection had deepened, solidified in a way that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Jason's voice cut through the haze, his grip on her shoulders, grounding her. Talk to me, what's going on? She forced herself to focus, to push through the dizzying swirl of emotions and sensations. The bindings, she gasped at, her voice is strained, it's in growing stronger. Jason's face paled stronger. How Nara shook her head, struggling to catch her breath. I don't know. But it's like we're merging our minds, our bodies, everything. Jason's hands tightened on her shoulders, his expression a mix of fear and determination. We need to control it, whatever this is. We can't let it take over. Niara nodded, though. Her heart pounded in her chest. Control, that was the key. But how could they control something so powerful, sound predictable as the last light of the suns faded from the sky, plunging the world into darkness? Niara felt a shift deep within her, an awakening. The binding wasn't just about survival. It was about unlocking something far greater, power, yes, but also understanding and maybe even love. But that realization came with a warning. If they couldn't find balance, if they couldn't learn to trust each other and wield this power together, it would destroy them. Jason's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity as she spoke the words that would seal their fate. We figured this out together, and for the first time since the rite had begun, Nara believed they just might.